Well, kia ora and welcome to the programme. You're watching GREG, the Government Regulatory Practice Initiative, based here in New Zealand. My name's Ian Kaplan. It's a pleasure to join you this month for webinar number 10, the conversation about regulatory intelligence. But before we converse about anything at all, GREG is hosted by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. And that's why I will open, as I always do, with MB's opening karakia. I do so now. Tawhia, Tamana, Kimo, Kimaya, Kahuri, Takuaro, Kite Pai, Kahurangi, Keira, Te Oranga Moku, Mamahi Tahi, Kaora, Kapuawai, Amato, Mahi, Katoa, Kapono, Katika, Tihei Moriora. Well, now we're together, members of the audience. It's lovely to see you. And as always, these are conversations that GREG puts on to assist or inspire, or dare I say, provoke conversations that you may have about subjects that are intrinsically connected to the profession of regulation, either directly or possibly a little less directly. I think this one's pretty pervasive, and looking at the numbers, clicking on the screen as you file in, members of the audience, is plain that at least 100 or more of you, frankly, at the current tally, care about this one. This is a conversation about regulatory intelligence. These webinars are conducted in public, they're live and they're recorded, and that's why it always falls to me to very happily say, wherever and indeed whenever you find yourselves watching this, you're very welcome here, members of the audience. What does intelligence mean, and what does it not mean? How does it work in a regulatory context? And I'm thinking of investigators, but I'm not limiting it to that. I'm thinking of policy. Everybody needs a bit of intel. What are the real and practical landscapes within which this plays out? A conversation, in a sense, about intelligent decision making, landscape and memory in the real world could be other things that we could describe this webinar as embracing. And that's because, for the most part, our guests will be saying that intelligent decision making equals intelligence-led decision making. It's very much part of the case of that. The legacy that Intel leaves us and also carries us forward with can be used and played across a variety of landscapes. And we're going to talk about that, whether it's tactical, operational, or strategic. So to have an intelligent conversation with us, I will just cue in our guest in just a moment. But before I do, some usual housekeeping. For those of you who are regular viewers, you'll know that just by scrolling down to the bottom of the screen, you will see all sorts of things, including, without limitation, a Q&A function. Please do drop in questions and comments at any point in this conversation. It's your conversation too. We'll get to them. If you'd like to vote on them, you can stick a thumbs up, because I can see convulsing in the right-hand corner of my screen the sort of a tabulated order of the questions as you rank them. You can also emote. Please feel free to emote. The very oddly designed by Zoom little face with the cross embedded in the upper right-hand corner of the head. Don't know why, not my pay grade. You can emote. I can see some of you already are. And also, it's not rude to talk to each other. You can chat. This is a professional conversation amongst ourselves too. And to help us, therefore, untangle all of the things we're about to talk about very intelligently indeed, we go straight to our panellists. Now, you will notice that to the right of my screen is not Jackie Ellis of MB, but we're equally blessed to have a colleague, Graeme Jewell, who is the National Manager of Regulatory Intelligence at MB. Graeme, a very warm welcome to you. Nice to see you. And those of you who are in the investigations community of practice, and I might just have a little plug for that later, members of the audience will know Graeme from there as well, from his recent appearance. I'm equally delighted to say hello to James Dodwell, who's a Principal Advisor, Regulatory Systems at Tomata ROI. And gentlemen, welcome to you both. I'll kick off with the questions, but that's without prejudice to you being able to jump in, folks, at any time. And I'm going to start with this. Graeme, kia ora and welcome to you. What is it that you understand by the meaning of intelligence?
Kia ora, Ian. Always start with the easy question. Appreciate it. Kia ora, audience. That question, what is intelligence, in my career has been one very much of personal preference, depending on whether you are a casual observer of intelligence, someone who sees intelligence on the big screen, perhaps someone who uses intelligence, or someone who creates intelligence. Through my kind of journey on this, I've begun to realize that intelligence is anything that someone finds of value. It's a piece of information that someone finds that is of value to a decision that they want to make. And sometimes that can just be what we might call a raw piece of intelligence, a raw piece of information. or something that actually has had some kind of process given to it to give it more value. And that's the definition and the distinction we need to understand between what someone might consider as intelligence and what an intelligence function might be. And so, Ian, your question kind of is asking two bits there. It's asking what we call that information that we might label intelligence, and then what is intelligence if it's sitting within your organization. And if you do have intelligence or intelligence analysts or other functions within what we might define as intelligence, it is there to give that information more value. It is there perhaps to amalgamate it with other information, to take away any bias or prejudice that might be sitting within that analysis of the information itself, the collection of it. There's a lot of intelligence, is a lot of things to a lot of people. But the idea of doing intelligence work is to make information more valuable. That's kind of where I land on it these days.
That's interesting. I mean, you have quite a bit of intelligence to be able to deconstruct me. Intelligence is a raw material, it's a job, it's so much more as well in terms of strategic purpose. James, what does it mean to you?
Well, I completely agree with what Graeme said for a start. But one of the things I like to do is I like to think about the reason why we have intelligence in the first place in regulation. And so that really goes to the heart of what a regulator is. And at its simplest, a regulator is there to do something to a system, to get it into a desirable state. So to do that, we need to know what that desirable state is. We need to know what the current state is. And we need to understand the full reasons for any difference. And that's where the intelligence comes in. And this is for the purpose of making good decisions about how we can intervene into that system to either maintain the current state or to achieve a desirable state. There's also, it's a term that gets used in different contexts and in different ways and sometimes takes on different meanings. And one of the distinctions that I'd like to make is the difference between data, information, and intelligence.
Yeah.
So your data is really your starting point, which Graeme talked about, and you've got to clean that up. It's unreliable, it lacks form. And once you've cleaned it up and given it some form, that might be by categorizing or do some kind of simple analysis. Then you can sort of reach that information stage. The intelligence stage, for me, is when you've moved beyond the simple characterization and cleanup of that information, and you're able to do more intelligent things with it. So you're able to make predictions about the system, for example. That's probably a key distinction. I talk about it being the difference between being able to paint a picture and being able to tell a story. And so it's kind of looking at it from that maturity lens. It's like it's the most mature form that we can take for what we're trying to understand.
Thank you, Jess. There's so much to unpack there. We've got an hour together, members, and we'll get unpacking. And don't forget to jump in with your questions and comments. I can see stuff coming through at the moment. I mean, one of the things I think you've both touched on is, if you like, the implicit multi-layering. And I just wonder if we can sort of shape that a little bit in terms of it touching intel, touching strategic, that sort of meta piece, the operation of what's happening generally in the environment near me, and tactical when we sort of have the long arm future view of what to do next in that environment. I don't know how useful is that taxonomy, and that's for any of you.
Could I jump in?
Do.
I found this really interesting because I'm new to the intelligence community, so I don't have a background in intel. I've got a background in human factors, I've got a background in regulation, I've got a background in investigations, and I've got a background in other things, but I haven't done intel. So the reason I'm involved in intel now is because I'm designing term-out-wise systems for generating intelligence and putting it into decision making. I've found that hierarchy that you just mentioned, strategic, operational, and tactical, really interesting because it gets talked about in two slightly different ways in terms of that hierarchy. Strategy is always at the top, strategic decision making, long term, your most important influential people in the organization. Then below that, sometimes it gets talked about as the operational level, sometimes it gets talked about as a tactical level, and then the bottom level, same thing again. So you can end up with these two different hierarchies depending on whether you're looking at intelligence from a military background or whether you're looking at it from a business background. And I'm really curious because I don't understand why these two things are different. And I'm really curious to understand that.
There is that kind of interconnection with the military military history, isn't it? I don't know, Graeme, if you want to jump in on that sort of, I guess, continuation, and also what James points to in terms of the distinctions that he's mentioned.
I think James is right that it's an interesting conversation. It's better to think of it as kind of a spectrum. The idea that a tactical piece of intelligence, and this is the traditional understanding, is something that might be very kind of target specific or event specific, that is looking at a very defined piece of an issue or a risk that we need to know more about in order to make decisions to either stop or to respond to. And then you kind of go all the way to strategic, as James was saying. That is about the high level decisions and perhaps even the future, the predicting, the foresight that James mentioned as well. And the operational is this kind of bit in the middle where it moves up from the individual instances and talks about kind of aggregated information, but maybe wants to look at the operating environment and clarity around that, rather than, say, the more strategic impacts of, say, policy or the behaviors of the people you're looking at. What this means for a regulatory system is actually quite important because it depends on the regulators that you're trying to provide your insight to, your intelligence to, this value-added information that we're talking about. Noting that the question in the Q&A at the moment about just between information intelligence and evidence in particular, if you think about your investigators, an investigator wants to usually collect evidence, information that they can use in order to pull some kind of regulatory lever that usually has to meet some kind of threshold. In a criminal sense, it might be higher than would it be in a civil sense, but we all have rules in the way that we can use information, and they have to meet certain evidential thresholds or factual thresholds, if you will. The point about intelligence, and this is why we can work across this tactical, this kind of one-to-one, also the one-to-many, and the strategic, is that intelligence is about assessment, it's about opinion. And so in an intelligence function, we will often say we think this is happening, we think this is likely or this is unlikely. And it usually would not enter any kind of evidential process or otherwise, because that's what goes down the line of misleading the court and all kinds of things that you don't want in judicial spaces. But the point here is that tactical, operational, strategic is actually about the impact of the information, the intelligence that you're providing. So the value of that information, how that helps a decision maker, how it gives them what we might call decision advantage, allows them to then decide how they want to orientate their work. And so if it's a strategic one, you might have a different customer to an operational or tactical. But a tactical piece could also have a strategic outcome. If you find a single issue, then all of a sudden you realize that's quite a big thing and a policy needs to change within a regulatory system. Then that has quite a strategic impact.
And we've looked, and it's interesting, this is sort of episode 10, and episode 1 was about a conversation about regulatory language, and the question has a connection with that. And I think you've dealt with the question, Graeme, the distinction between an often interchangeable use of terms info, intel, and evidence, and the need to be able to be on the same page with, the regulators that an intelligence professional is working with. I guess once we've got through the brass tacks of what we're talking about in terms of language, how important, we've touched on this a little bit, is the purpose and the reason that somebody wants intelligence. James, you might want to kick off with this.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, and Graeme has touched on this. You've got different levels in the organisation that may be asking for intelligence to inform different kinds of decision making, whether it's frontline decision making or whether it's more strategic, high level decision making. You really need to understand what your audience is, what their needs are, what the constraints are that you're working within before you can develop a good piece of intelligence. So you need to work with those decision making so that you can make sure that you've got the scope right, so that you've agreed those limitations, because some of those limitations will come from the business requirements. Sometimes those limitations will come from constraints on the intelligence unit. And that way you can choose the right approach, the right tools. So, for example, you could spend several weeks developing a comprehensive 20-page analysis when what was needed was a quick and dirty decision today, and that's not going to help. Conversely, you could produce a really low fidelity one-pager that uses unreliable data and doesn't explore underlying causes. That shouldn't inform long-term plans, So really about understanding the needs of your client.
And I think there's one thing there, and Graeme, I'll call you in on this if I may, because I mean I think we're talking about ad hocery. I need something real quick and dirty, you know, ... But then there's that long-termism. So we'll talk about relationships definitely later in the webinar. I guess the other thing that you touched on, James, is the idea, at least implicitly, that actually the person who is seeking the intelligence needs to know what they want it for. And that sounds an awfully trying thing to say, but I'm not so sure it is.
Oh, it's very relevant.
Graeme, what do you say to that?
It's a little triggering, Ian, to be honest. It's quite the question. Intelligence, people that are within the intelligence profession that are trained in intelligence and all of that want to be valued, right? We all want to come to work to be valued and do work that is valued by others. And particularly intelligence, it's kind of a service industry because we are helping others achieve their goals. But if an organization doesn't understand what it needs intelligence for and the value thereof, it can be really quite disheartening for the people inside an intelligence function to not be situated properly in that decision-making chain. It's a similar kind of vibe when that decision-making chain is not very clear. And we've talked a little bit about the history of intelligence, well, not the history, but the other kind of formulations of it. And the decision-making processes within the military in particular, and also less so, but more than the regulatory environment, the police, intelligence is kind of baked into that decision-making process. And in a regulatory system, it's not there always. And my colleague Gordon Burns here at MB Albert, formerly of MPI, New Zealand Police, often talks about what he calls a federated systems of insight. And any decision maker isn't just going to be listening to one, has many, many sources of this insight that they use to make their decisions. And intelligence is just one of those lanes. Now, depending on the organization you're in, it will have a certain amount of value. And it will have a certain amount of value that is attributed to the decision maker themselves, but also how well that intelligence function is integrated into collection of information, providing good analysis, good people that do that analysis, and that, to Ian's point, that timeliness that actually do they understand the customer, and does the customer understand what they can get from intelligence? And
critically,
yeah, I was going to say for intelligence in a regulatory system, it's something we're still learning, I think.
Yeah, and critically, it goes to decision advantage.
That's right, and the conversations I have with the regulators here at MB are often about what are you trying to achieve here, and they might talk about regulatory theory around we're trying to target risk, we want to reduce harm, or we want to drive compliance. These are all very different things. Sometimes they're like, actually, we just want to do 100 cases this year. So intelligence is actually needs to understand what those goals are and can apply its analysis and add the value to make sure that those decisions within that context make sense. And I think it's a hard thing, I think, for intelligence sometimes to properly understand their customer and then position itself appropriately, particularly if it's a new and immature relationship.
Yeah, no, thank you, Graeme. It's we're coming to the point, members of the audience, plenty going on, and I know you're listening and looking keenly. You are very welcome, and I know you're not shy. Let's pop some questions and thoughts in as you go, and I expect I'll see some of those. I want to talk about painting the apocalypse. If I can put it that crudely, what happens in a professional world, in a regulatory world, without intelligence? You know, it's not a nice to have, but just in case there's anyone in the audience who thinks, actually, it's a surrogate for my gut because I've been doing this since 1974. I don't need intel. What do you say to that, I'm sure, hypothetical construct that I've just created? Painting the apocalypse, world without intel, and that's for both of you.
I think it's very difficult to imagine a world without intelligence, because I think one of the things that we tend to do is we tend to think intelligence in a regulatory sense is about an intelligence unit and intelligence analysts. They play an important role, but intelligence is something that belongs to the regulator. And if it isn't gathering intelligence deliberately and making good use of that intelligence, it's doing it accidentally. You know, there's people going out and interacting with the system all the time. There's always information coming in. You know, so and I like to think about this in terms of organisms. So if you think about the most basic organism is able to respond to its environment by sensing it, by interpreting it, by making decisions, taking action, and remembering the effects of its actions. Now that's a basic organism. So any regulator can at least do that. More evolved organisms use intelligence and learning to develop better and better ways to overcome problems. And so I think of this in terms of maturity. I don't think you can have a regulator that doesn't have some form of intelligence, but we need to have more mature intelligence. We shouldn't be basic organisms.
That's interesting. And that almost is a biological positioning, kind of, you've made the sale. Graeme, what do you say taking this further?
James is on the money when he kind of says that everyone, to some extent, does intelligence work, that they assess certain things. When you cross the road, you're collecting all the information and you're deciding how fast that bus is going. Is it a bus or a bicycle? And then you're deciding how you might want to act on that. Like, we're all doing these processes. The idea of having intelligence function is that you hire people that are very good at that. You give them access to as much information as you can, and you give them tools to allow them to do it quickly and to meet the needs of the customer. So it's there, like I said before, as kind of a service industry. James also talked about organizations and regulatory systems. I think this is really true of, is there is a lot of information, a lot of data that we collect. It is constantly people enter these systems. They have to, or companies, and they have to provide information to us while they're in it, and then to enter it, and then as they're kind of going through it, and we're trying to get good outcomes for them and for New Zealand. MB's previously been called data rich, intelligence poor. And that just means that we have a lot of siloed data. And so people within those silos are working on it, but we're not bringing the joint stuff together. And the former head of Intel here at MB, Rachel Butler, she's now Maritime NZ, used to describe things with like a traditional eye, like a little eye, and a big eye. And that big eye stuff is the opportunity that we have in a regulatory system to use that system-wide kind of depersonalized data to understand trends and patterns of the behaviors of those within our systems, and bring what might be traditionally kind of just useful reporting within business intelligence or market intelligence to kind of bring a real analytical lens to allow our regulatory customers to use that to help their decision making day to day or strategically. And that is the opportunity that stands in front of us.
Let me pick up on that, Graeme, for me. So actually, very opportune question that comes in, which, and thank you for it to the questioner. You'll see this, members of the audience. In a regulatory system, management can get somewhat frustrated, and I think this is possibly an anecdotal, with these quote likely, quote highly likely type assessments. I'm sure you've seen it, heard it. How can Intel functions or teams make clear the actual risk for management in order for them to make useful decisions? So clearly, understanding the value of intelligence, gathering the exercise, the data turned into intelligence, the raw material turned into something. But the badge on it might be more nebulous than the management's preference. What do you both say to that?
Can I jump on that one? Just because it gave me a wry smile, that one, Debbie. Thank you for the question. We often, there's a practice within intelligence to use what we call probabilistic language. And that is those assessments and we kind of sometimes put a percentage, a link to things like likely or realistic possibility. And our senior management, in particular our senior customers, often roll their eyes when they see that stuff. Often we'll put it in caps within intelligence product and all that kind of thing. And we've realized that the tradecraft around doing that assessment work is not meeting the customer's needs, right? We need to speak more plainly and more directly about what we're trying to say here and understand how that customer might want to use it, and the value of what we're trying to advise them on. And so those terms like likely and all the rest can take away from what you're trying to actually advise your customer of. So I think that, again, within a regulatory environment, we're not baked into the decision making. There is not decades and decades of training on how to use intelligence within these systems. We need to make sure that we are adaptable. Intelligence is adaptable to be used as intended.
I guess with that in mind, what would you have as an alternative to the probabilistic statements, just as an example? Numbers?
No. What I'm trying to say here is speak the language of your regulator.
Yeah.
And understand how they talk about the world, for sure. But if you are trying to make an assessment to say something is likely or not, just say it in simple ways. There's an ironic thing sometimes that we would make an assessment that says something is almost certain, and that's up to a 95%. That's because nothing is certain in this life. And in a pure kind of tradecraft sense, it's like, it's almost certain the sun's going to come up tomorrow. And the point being that actually, let's speak plainly to people and say, yes, the sun is going to come. And that's what allows the intelligence to have a better impact, a more kind of forthright and usable impact than just relying on these kind of tradecraft statements.
I think that's an excellent point to make. Is the usability of your products is at the heart of intelligence, isn't it? It doesn't matter how accurate your intelligence is if people can't leverage that information because they don't understand it. And you're right, intelligence analysts and other people and regulators have different backgrounds, different experiences, different language. So it's important to, work with them to understand each other.
Yeah, and it goes, I think, to relationships and empathy. And I mean, it's one of the tropes that we see, across the sort of policy, operational policy, regulatory and communications. Yes, there's sometimes these one and done transactions, but at some level there needs to be a sort of a continuing and dynamic relationship between the intelligence function, if it's standalone and discrete in an agency, and the regulatory executive function. And so that kind of two-way hopefully breeds that sort of understanding. I guess it's worth just dwelling on that point for just a sec. What's the value of having that long-term kind of relationship between those units, rather than I'm just going to nip over to the fifth floor to get a quickie answer and then never see him again until next time?
Okay, well, I think Graeme has mentioned decision advantage already, and I think that's really the first thing I would say is so critical. Is about being able to have informed decision making going on in your organisation. Access to up-to-date and accurate regulatory intelligence is just essential for making good decisions. Another thing is for responsiveness and agility. So if you can have a continuing relationship between the decision makers and the intelligence generation part of your business, that enables quicker responses to emerging risks, to changes in the system, changes in technology, and that's really important. Consistency and coherence, a really strong relationship between the functions means that your decisions are based on a consistent understanding of the regulatory landscape, including risks. A good relationship enhances collaboration, and collaboration is really critical because we've already touched on that a lot of that intelligence is actually coming out of your operational parts or other parts of the business. So it's really good to get those perspectives together and triangulate, and that can confirm what you're trying to prove, or it might disprove it, and that's really important too.
And after you.
And finally, I was going to say continuous improvement. I think the intelligence unit is in a wonderful position where it can aid the continuous improvement of the organisation as a whole.
Yes. It was just triggering something actually from the questions as well, and this may be off piece, but I think you've been asked, Graeme, for an encore just about federated decision-making idea.
Yeah.
The viewer is very sort of struck by the practical example. I don't know if it touches this point directly, but perhaps you could just repeat it.
No, it's very on point for this. So yeah, that federated system of insight. So you understand that anyone who's making a decision, whether it's when they get to work in the morning and they're going to target that non-compliant actor in the regulatory system or not, or they're going to make some strategic decision about policy, that the person making that decision has a range of things they're trying to understand before they even make that decision. And then again, before they even act on that decision. So what we've found in regulatory intelligence, because intelligence isn't so baked into that decision-making process, that it's very important that intelligence is there to inform that process as early as possible in what some people call the orientate or the collection phase of the decision-making process. And making sure that we are there as early as possible to help people then make the decision. The practical kind of example of that is I can give you two, one strategic, one that go back to that about before. In a strategic sense, what we are finding is that often our intelligence isn't there to actually inform a decision maker. It's there for that decision maker to then have impact themselves in a wider forum to inform other decision making. So we will often produce an intelligence product for a customer that then has like a note or a memo on top of it from that customer that goes to some decision making forum.
Yeah.
And this is particularly true within the immigration system. If we provide insight about how companies or people are being compliant or non-compliant with, in that system, those charged with monitoring the risks within that system want to take that intelligence with a kind of a, we need to have decisions on this now based on this intelligence to someone else.
Yeah.
That's really important that we understand that we're really early in that. We're not intel for that decision making. There's a process for that. But in a tactical sense, it's a lot quicker. And I'm trying really hard to get my team understanding their customers more, to our earlier point as well, to understand what might work for them and challenging them and scaring them a little, because intelligence analysts are often quite introverted folk. And say, well, how do you get that information quickly to someone? And how do you do it in a way that they actually want to hear? So, you know, the joke around EV intelligence is that Graeme wants intelligence through TikTok videos, because a 20-second interpretive dance might be the way that the customer actually wants it.
Why not? And I think it's
can I touch
interesting
on
to see the
something,
customer base. Are you going to do an interpretive dance through Team First, James?
No, but I was going to touch on something that Graeme said around people not necessarily liking what you tell them through your intelligence. And this relates to engaging with intelligence early. All regulators are full of experts, and experts have theories around why things are the way they are. And sometimes that can build up a bit of momentum. One of the dangers here as an expert, though, is that good old confirmation bias. You know, I leave it too late to get some intelligence to either validate or disprove my theory. And I don't like the intel because I've been talking to all these people and the intel doesn't match what I've been saying. I'm curious, Graeme, in your experience, whether that's a common phenomenon.
I think it's common, but it's not the majority of the time. Turns out most people's guts are generally true to some extent. There can be a bias built into that, for sure, and there's what we would call collection bias. So you're just looking at information just to confirm the information that you already think you know. But those times that you do pick up a stone and you find things that people didn't expect, those are actually really, really important ones, and they do happen, because for a long time, particularly if you haven't had intelligence in your system for a long time, you have been running off the information available to you, which is this collection bias, confirmation bias I'm talking about, because you're only seeing what you know. And to have intelligence come in to kind of counter that and to open up new possibilities, that's a really big opportunity. This particularly happens in lots of systems. Well, one example I could talk about is that immigration. And we're talking about trafficking in persons. And this is the exploitation by people of other people, for their own monetary gain, in slavery and moving them around and controlling their movements in ways that I think we would all kind of describe as quite abhorrent. But the nature of the offending there is so hidden, because it's not moving a commodity. A drug can't hide itself. A drug can't be a bad witness, for example, if a drug is being trafficked. But a person, the human nature of all of this means that it is very, very hidden. And so it's very hard for immigration to know about trafficking. And for a long time, because the information wasn't being collected, it wasn't available to them, they weren't kind of intelligence informed on that. It was very hard to know what the landscape of trafficking in people was in New Zealand. And only now are we starting to be far more considerate in how we collect that information, bring it into a place and do what we've talked about before, do the analysis and the assessment to create value and then go, oh, actually, that's what that looks like. But intelligence allows you to do that.
And there's got to be room for iteration, hasn't there? There's got to be permission, if I put it this way, not just to be right, but as we go along the way for our experts, sometimes, frankly, to get it wrong. And that's a mark of organisational maturity, but not everybody accepts that.
That's true. I think it's a very human thing too, not just an organisational thing, that it's okay to be wrong. And it leads us to a very kind of salient point, I suppose, in we are now 2023, we're 20 years on from the invasion of the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And what led to that was some pretty poor intelligence. Everyone was saying that Saddam Hussein was creating weapons of mass destruction, and he was also developing capability to deploy those weapons via missiles and all the rest. And so powers that be decided to invade Iraq. Now, there are a lot of theories around perhaps the real reason, but the valid point being made here is that that was used as the rationale at the UN on why that invasion was a good idea. So decision makers do use intelligence, but if you don't do it right, if you were just trying to confirm something you think you already know, then you're going to do nothing but end up with a much poorer decision. And if we take Iraq as the pertinent example, quite bad outcome for a lot of people.
Yeah, I will remember those events, having sat next to the building where there was a very, very heavy-duty public inquiry in London, one, I think, from memory, of many, the value of intelligence and the apocalypse if you don't have it. Now, members of the audience, you're clearly not shy. What you are doing is, I think, transposing or projecting your Q&A into the chat, which is fine because we can all see them, and that's great. But if you've got questions, do drop them into the Q&A. It's the better box. If you've just recently joined us, and there will be one or two of the over 100 of you at least that have a warm welcome from us to a conversation about regulatory intelligence with Graeme, Jewell and James Dodwell. We're going fine, and we're really pleased to have them both in. I'm just going to pick a few questions which come up in the chat, because apart from the request to have some artistic communication of Intel products, thank you very much for that one. The recording of today will be made available as it will in the ordinary way. But what you don't get, of course, in the recording is the live of being here and being able to ask questions and join the conversation directly. I do also do a commercial break for our GREG newsletter, which is in the chat. There's a link. I mention our communities of practice on our GREG website, mentioned in the newsletter as well. May well be that that's the sort of place where you can meet like-minded people to discuss issues of this kind. One of the things which has pervaded the bulk of these 10 episodes that we've had since this series started and elsewhere is the notion of regulatory stewardship. It's a real thing. One of the questions that comes up here is, in effect, what's the connection between regulatory intelligence and regulatory stewardship? And gents, that's right for both of you.
I don't mind going first. Okay, so I see a very close relationship between these two, and I sort of implied it earlier when I talked about the potential value of an intelligence unit in the continuous improvement space for an organisation. So one of the approaches we're taking as we design our intelligence capability at Tamata Arawai is consideration that one of the things that holds back our interventions into the system is sometimes ourselves. And we're a new regulator. We are developing, and so a part of our intelligence system is not just about looking outward at the system and understanding that. It's about understanding where we are at, and what is holding us back. What is our maturity journey, and where are we in it? Because this is really important, and it's also important not just in terms of growing. It's also important in terms of decision making, because when you are making decisions using intelligence, you need to understand what the limitations of our ability to intervene are. And so regulatory stewardship comes in there because it's about us, but it's also about that regulatory framework. The regulatory framework may be holding us back as well. So it's really important to take a holistic view of intelligence. So, intelligence isn't just generated by the intelligence unit. You might get good intel about the performance of your regulatory framework from your policy team, or from people in frontline operations who are saying, oh, this regulation's just not working. This is all building up part of your intelligence picture, and it all needs to feed into improving the system.
It's an interesting one, because I guess TA is a new regulator. We had the chief executive then was at the GREG conference last year. By the way, members of the audience, a couple of weeks ago, I won't be plugging stuff all the time, but we will actually be doing a big drop of all 10 films that arose from that conference, so you'll be able to see it again or for the first time. In terms of a new organisation establishing itself, I guess it comes into effect even more that it's critical that the Intel function is A, establishing itself, and B, is in the centre of things with everybody else when performing the stewardship acts and mindset.
Sorry,
And
what's the question?
well, I was just thinking, Bill, who was the CEO of TA, was saying, about the sort of the interesting, I guess, aspects of setting up as a new regulator in town. And it just something you said, James, triggered that idea that, intelligence is linked to regulatory stewardship. If you're in a newly formed agency or entity or organisation, the importance of establishing, if you like, the stake of the importance of intelligence is really there up front, isn't it?
Yeah, look, absolutely, and that's a core part of my work. I mean, I think there's a good reason why I've been asked to build our stuff on stewardship at the same time as leading the development of the intelligence capability.
Absolutely,
but we very clearly see them as interlinked.
And it's not something necessarily across the place that everybody has, is it? In terms of either a standalone intelligence unit or even, I guess, an appreciation of the value of intelligence. I mean, I'm looking at some of these questions and chats coming through here, and there's some quite senior figures saying, look, the main problem I'm still hearing around the traps is senior manager often prefers to go on the gut instinct. How do we make these intel processes visible at the executive level? And linked upstairs to some of the other Q&A stroke chat is how is it we can perhaps upskill people who are dealing to understand better what intel means and its value? I don't know, Graeme, do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I've picked up on those questions too. Murray's point about the gut instinct does come back to what we were talking before, the two things about where is intelligence function situated and therefore valued within decision making within your system, within your regulatory system. And that will come with a bunch of bias. Like I said before, some senior managers only know about intelligence from certain films, certain TV shows, and so have a certain view of what it actually is. And the other question you referenced there was by Abby, and Abby and I were just talking about this just the other day, about how it can be hard to get the right kind of, input's the wrong word, value from your intelligence within that decision-making process to your senior leadership if they are expecting one thing, but actually you're saying that intelligence is another. That is an extremely hard thing to do, and it's something that I constantly see in intelligence functions across all governments, to be fair. It comes back to this idea of stewardship that you were talking about, Ian, and do your senior leaders, know what they want by stewardship and what they're trying to deliver under that stewardship vibe? And then do they know what intelligence is? One of the things we've been very conscious of here at MB is making sure that intelligence doesn't move into performance assessment of a regulatory system, that we aren't there to assess how well the system's performing. We're not even there necessarily to assess whether harmful outcomes are happening or not. That's not our job. That is a business intelligence job. That's a performance assessment job, that kind of thing. But some senior leaders will be like, hey, Intel, tell us how we're doing. And actually, that's not the point. We're here to understand what decisions they want to make and then help them have decision advantage through the processes we go through. But again, pulling it back to I make Gordon Burns, that federated system of insight. Don't ever think that your leader is only ever going to listen to the intelligence. You have to be there much earlier on, help orientate that person's thinking, and so that they value the intelligence with regards to their gut and their boss and that political implication and all the rest.
Yeah,
I think it's important to reflect on why sometimes people might want to rely on their gut instinct, and sometimes it relates to a perception and sometimes a misperception about the timeliness and value, like you mentioned, of intelligence. And some reassurance and a good relationship with the people who are using that intelligence can help with this, because I mean, a gut instinct is a fine starting point, but unless timeliness is an issue, then you should be looking at validating your gut instinct, and that's only going to increase the quality of the decision you make.
Yeah, it is that human need for reassurance, isn't it? Either by one's gut or I guess there's a potential surrogate for that intel, but the danger is, presumably, as one of our questions is saying, that shopping, I should italicize that, or air quote it, for confirmation intel's the real problem, because it's probably too little too late, isn't it? The question goes on to say what safeguard processes are available to be deployed to capture this issue. I wonder if one of your answers that you've both implicitly given is good relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also implied that openness to being wrong is really important. We can't learn and grow as individuals unless we're open to being wrong. And I think that most people want to learn and grow.
I mean, that happens, right? I can give you two examples recently. One, where a regulator at MB brought 3 different identities and saying, can you find a way to prove that this is the same person? And our intelligence process found that it was 3 different people. And that's what we had to go back with and said, sorry, your gut was wrong. And what the conversations that we have is when someone comes to us with a question like that, we very deliberately say, that's a good hypothesis. We'll test it for you.
Yeah.
That's the way to go about that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Relationship management and empathy and humility. I mean, they're all kind of things that actually really do seem to come in, not just here, but frankly, in all of the kind of relationships that we express and implicitly touch upon across these webinars and elsewhere. What I've got, and I think I'm sort of deciphering it from some of the questions that are coming through, we talked about WMD as an example of how intelligence didn't help quality decision making. Can you gents give me an example of how intelligence has helped quality decision making, obviously as much as you professionally probably can on a public webinar?
Well, I mean, we can actually use the same example that Graeme used, but from a slightly different angle. So he's given a really good example of how there was poor intelligence that led up to that war. There was also some really good examples of really good intelligence, which resulted in minimization of casualties. So one of the things about modern warfare, as opposed to traditional warfare, you line up your people, they line up their people, and generally the army that's bigger wins. With modern warfare, we said, all right, well, that's great, but what's going on behind the scenes? What can we do to give ourselves a bit of an advantage so that their numbers don't matter as much? And the Gulf War was an excellent example of the sophisticated intelligence enabling precision strikes on key pieces of infrastructure to disrupt the opponent's ability to coordinate and command their forces, but also to do things like just simple things like inability to fuel their tanks. A tank's not good if you can't move it. So there's some really good examples in there as well. So and that's true of any particular example. There's going to be things which are good about it, things which are bad.
And I think that's the real world, isn't it, Graeme, in terms of, the advice that you and your colleagues are giving. It's sort of parts of it are going to be welcome, parts of it are going to be less welcome. It's another advisory gig.
Yeah. If we to bring an example back to kind of a regulatory system, and I will kind of just speak broadly to immigration here because it's our biggest customer here at MB at the moment. The insights that we can provide around how people use the immigration system, particularly the behaviours of those employing people, is really quite pertinent. But the one example I suppose I want to bring up is trying to toss up a bunch of examples in my head actually that's going to really show that how in a regulatory space, the decision advantage, the ability to bring information together is really, really quite powerful. So the example I'm going to put to it is quite an old one, to be honest. It's from about 2015-16. But we had kind of large fraud within the student visa caseload from a certain group of nationality, all coming in to do a certain study a student, a certain visa type, and then move on to certain jobs. And what we found out, because of our intelligence work, particularly because we went across systems and we could talk to other partners, particularly international partners in this case, but that fraud was quite coordinated offshore from New Zealand and very targeted to New Zealand for a specific providing. And bringing that together allowed immigration then to have a conversation about that, the fraud and like the fact that we've got thousands of people here that have lied to us and perhaps shouldn't be here, but the value that people actually are already adding to the economy with the jobs that they are in. And that's a very kind of mature conversation, but without that insight, it was actually hard to have that conversation about where you should have the balance. Should we just deport all these people because they have lied on their immigration visa applications? Or do we realize that taking 2,000 people out of this sector would actually be quite a negative effect, quite harmful on the economy? And those are the conversations that actually, in the end, filtered all the way up to ministers.
Yeah, and very nuanced indeed they are too. James, I can see you, I think, nodding. Did you want to add anything?
No, just an agreement.
No comment. Okay, very good. There's no shortage of stuff to talk to, and there's no shortage of questions coming from you now. I think this question has been partly dealt with, but perhaps we could just sharpen it a bit. It's got quite a few votes. We hear that as a modern regulator, we need to be risk-based intelligence led. But how does intelligence-led, I guess, beyond the long-term strategy advice, really land in practice? How does forecasting enable or improve frontline decision-making? I think, in a sense, Graeme, your example may have touched on a little bit of that, although it was perhaps less future forecasting and more sort of nuanced interpretation. But looking at that kind of, the futurism almost, the crystal ball stuff.
Yeah, so there's two sides to that. There's that future crystal ball thing, and then there's that idea of being intelligence led. And I question people when they say that we should be intelligence led. I ask who wrote that and do they know what intelligence really is. And like with regards to who's writing policy and strategy documents that says we should be intelligence led, because my point before about this whole range of information that people use to make decisions, intelligence is just one line in that. But to be led by it is perhaps ignoring all those other ones. But you can definitely be intelligence informed. And that is kind of the crux of what we're trying to get to here, is to have the value of intelligence being part of that decision-making process. The idea of then applying that to think of the future, to kind of do the crystal ball gazing, that is perhaps, again, a really valuable thing. Intelligence within the government, at least, is perhaps the most comfortable at putting their opinions on paper, because that's the job. We ask our analysts to do their good thinking with all the good information they have, to in the end just put their opinion down on paper to help inform a decision maker. So nothing that comes from intelligence, particularly in a regulatory system, would directly impact a user of a regulatory system. It still has to go through that filter of decision maker. So if we can say things like, if you do take this action or make this policy, it is likely that this is going to happen. And we can quantify that to a certain point with regards to the probabilistic language we talked before. We can say things this way. It's very likely, it's somewhat likely. Any way you want to slice that. That helps then someone decide whether they want to do it and what level of risk perhaps they might want to, that they're comfortable with, whatever their risk appetite is, or even the political outcomes of things, because that is the reality of the environment we work in. So we are comfortable in that. We train our people to think about the future. And the one example recently is immigration asked us, what does the world look like in 2025? And what does that mean for the New Zealand immigration system?
Yeah.
And that's quite a big question, right? And for us to kind of not just like, what does the world look like in 2025? Lots of people are saying that, but what does it mean for New Zealand's immigration system? It's quite a question. And to be able to give that insight to immigration and say, well, it probably means this, this, and this. There might be more or less compliance. We might be getting students or workers from different parts of the world than we have, say, pre-COVID and all the rest. That's very important for their decision-making about how they want to shape the future of not only like how they do their work day to day, but the functions and the structure of the team as well.
Yeah, and in 2025 ain't too far away, and these are quite practical, heavy questions. We're not sort of talking flying cars as such. I mean, I think that's the other thing, isn't it? And yet there has to be, and I think you've both really pointed to this, and so have you, members of the audience. And again, I see mirrors of this in the previous webinar on communications. There's got to be a culture that normalizes the dialogue vis-a-vis intelligence, hasn't there? And that's a mark potentially of organizational maturity. What do you both say to the absence of that culture? If the culture's not there, you can have the apparatus, and etc., but it's dead, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not going to work very well, is it? I mean, there's a number of key features of your culture which are going to make that relationship work really well. I mean, it all starts with transparency and open communication, doesn't it? Because without that, how do you know that you're working towards the same big picture? And that's really critical. Collaboration and teamwork we've touched on already, because success relies on a range of different capabilities, and a lot of your intelligence is actually going to come out of different parts of the business. You've got to be able to work with those other parts of the business so that you can consider that stuff with that bigger picture that you've agreed. Innovation and adaptability is another feature. It's critical to problem solving. It's a creative process. So I think that's another key element of the kind of culture you need. This isn't left field. Inclusiveness and diversity relates to our ability to collaborate effectively. Different perspectives add value, and I think that needs to be in there as well. Ethical behaviour and integrity is another feature, because our ethics and our behaviour define us, and they create that trust with each other in an organisation, but also with the community that we are trying to work with. We've already talked about evidence-based. I think that one goes without saying, but the problem there is that we can misunderstand or misattribute success or failure if we're not trying to evidence things. So that's another key feature of the culture, is having that focus on evidence, a focus on continuing learning and improvement, so that we're actually adapting and improving as an organisation. And finally, and this is the critical one for me, and it's the heart of my work, accountability and responsibility. Because if you haven't established accountability and responsibilities about how this is going to work, it won't.
No. And it is again the contours of the relationship, and as you say, the mutual accountability in a sense of the counterparts. If we don't have the size or the budget to have a big standalone intelligence unit, or dare I say any standalone intelligence unit, can we still do stuff?
Yeah, totally. If you can have a regulator of one person, and as long as they understand why they are there, there's a lot they can do. So any regulator should understand at a high level what the system is that it's responsible for and the problems that they're there to address. They may not have a detailed understanding of what's going wrong, but you know what? In that system, there'll be a whole bunch of people. And in that system, there'll be a whole bunch of people who aren't happy with how the system's working and want it to change. So New Zealand's a wonderful place full of people who love to help. So that regulator of one can engage with them and say, hey, this is my challenge. Help me understand things. And actually, how can you help me? I've come out of the electricity industry, which is a wonderful industry, and I'd love to go back there one day. A lot of industries, like the electricity industry, are really collaborative. They're really keen to work across organisations. There's lots of things going on, and so there's lots of people in industries who can help. So that's what you can do. You can ask for help.
Ask for help. That's a lovely way to end it. James, you've both been terrific. James and Graeme, thank you, gentlemen, both very, very much indeed. And I can see, members of the audience, that you've had fun as well. Stay tuned for our next episode. I won't give away the title at the moment, but we will be back in a month. And I will close with the MB Karakia. I do so now. Kahiki, titaku, ke watia, te ara, ke turukiai, te marama, huie, taikie. Members of the audience, till next time, stay safe, stay well, and ka kite.